All right, so after reading Story of an Hour yesterday, we're going to look at writing over this question specifically. When we look at doing analytical writing like this, the purpose is not so much to just look at what's the literal answer that's there, but it's more, how does the author inform you of that? We're looking more from the perspective of how the author creates meaning rather than what the literal answer is. And in doing the process of analysis, the writer's task goes from what you've done in previous years, which is more explaining, towards having to prove your point more clearly. We can break down the definition of analysis to basically say that it's explaining your perspective to someone else that didn't get it. And so it's going to open up the possible answers to the question to some degree, but it's going to limit them to what do we find within the text, because that's what's going to support the assertions we're going to make. So when we look here, the Mallard's marriage is a major part of the story. Our first task in being able to answer the question is to dig back in and find what are the words the author uses to describe the Mallard's marriage. In order to do that, you got to go back into the story. I'm going to give you some time to do that. And what we are looking for are definite quotations, words we can pull out and use to support that the author answers the question within the story. And so we need to find that evidence. So I'm going to give you time. Go back through. We're looking for, what does the author do? What are those words specifically? And kind of jot them down, copy them into a document, something like that to keep track, because we're going to create this on the board so that you have that visual of, hey, here's the quotes we need. having trouble finding stuff, look towards the 11th or 12th paragraph of the story. That would be a good place to start if you're just having trouble with where to look. Okay, so we're going to start to bring the conversation back together. And the biggest thing that I want to kind of hit for you is now that you're looking, you're probably going, there's not a whole lot here, but there is. A skill that you are very familiar with from previous years is inferencing. When you read something, what do you understand? And analysis is based on a foundation of inferencing. You need to pull on those skills of what you already know. Because this skill is something you've probably done. We're just going to refine and focus as we go through the year. What are some of the quotes that stood out to you that discuss the marriage between Mrs. Mallard and Mr. Mallard? Yes, what is it?
And yes, she might love them sometimes, and often she may not.
Is it had loved him or she loved him?
Had loved them.
Any other quotes that stood out to you?
There will be no one to live for during this coming year. She will live for herself.
Any others?
Paragraph 12. There will be no horrible will bending her. In that blind persistence which men and women believe they have the right to impose private will upon fellow people.
Absolutely. I'm going to add one more to this. It might be one you picked up on. It's in, I think, paragraph 11. When she talks about her husband and she talks about seeing him in the casket, and she says, the face that had never looked, save with love upon her. So even with just these, all of them discuss the relation, well, most of them discuss the relationship between the two of them. If there's one that maybe has to be linked to another to help to make it about the marriage, it's kind of this one. This one really supports what we're seeing here with the powerful will. Was her husband a bad guy? No, and she has to be very careful of this. Remember, Chopin is writing this story in the 19th century. And so the things that she has Mrs. Mallard go through make sense to a modern reader. But back then, there weren't a lot of female writers. So here's Kate Chopin writing a story about a woman. And the woman in the story, her husband dies, and she seemingly becomes overjoyed eventually at her freedom. What's a reader going to assume about Kate Chopin?
Instead of her being grateful for the freedom, she was never like her husband wanted him to die. Maybe.
Yes. A reader is that at the time is going to have a really hard time seeing Kate Chopin as separate from Mrs. Mallard. And they're going to go, oh my God, what a terrible woman she is. What an awful woman to write a story like this where she must hate her husband. Because a lot of times we have a hard time distancing an author from the things they write about. We want to put them together. Chopin has to play a really interesting game here because she does it in almost all of her writing. She empowers her female figures. She allows them to express these things that society at the time had said, like, oh, no. But she also has to keep the men from being bad. She has to keep the men in a lot of her stories in this way of like, you know what? They're not monsters. They loved her. It's the woman that wants out. And then by the end of the story, most of her stories all end in a similar way where the woman dies. Because she needs society to see that it's like, oh, look, she got it at least at the end, this woman. She punished her. So she gets it. Anybody who steps out of line, you die. And if you're looking at it and being like, that's really sexist, I know. That's why people got rid of her writing and pushed her away because they didn't agree with it. So she's got to play this really interesting game. And we see it here in how she discusses her husband. A lot of the quotes put it to Mrs. Mallard and leave Mr. Mallard as like, well, he was a good guy. Look, even here. Notice that she's the one that loved him sometimes, but often she had not. It's not about her husband. Remember, he's the guy that always looked at her with love. There's a lot that's here about this marriage that we can infer, where at first you're going, this is what? Our task in analyzing is to go, if this is the evidence that we found, what is the author telling us about it? We have to boil first, because I'm going to give you some thinking time. Based on the evidence that we found in the story, how would you answer this question in one sentence? How would you describe the Mallards' marriage in the story based on these quotes? So maybe some thinking time. Think about adjectives, especially descriptive words. What's a describing word that might help you here? So I'm going to give you a minute. If you need to type it, just to help get your thoughts together. And then we're going to kind of start to share and put together our answer. All right, anybody feel confident to kind of share? What's your answer? Dale.
I have two.
Okay.
Answers. First one would be perhaps they love each other equally at the beginning of the relationship. Over time, his possessiveness of her made her dislike him and then want to be free. Or she only married him because society pressured her into it because she must find a husband or you'll never make it.
Okay.
That's my second.
That their marriage wasn't perfect, but there was still love that they both had for each other.
Okay. Anybody have a different response? Okay, so if you're taking a look here, Dale, I'm going to start with yours. If we're looking at the evidence here, do we have anything to say that he changed? No, and so that might be where I would be a little more specific if I was going to answer with this one, because the evidence in the piece that you pull is going to help you to be right or wrong. Let me give you an example of this, and it's an extreme example. I know, go with me. If you were to say, their marriage didn't work because he was gay, is there anything in the story to do that? No. So I use the extreme example as a reason. A piece will inform you when you're wrong because there's no evidence to support it. But in the same way, you notice we came up with 3 different answers here that to some degree can all be seen as correct. There's a lot of ways you can be right with analysis and a lot of ways you can be wrong, but it's the text that's always going to help you to know that you're right. So if I was going to look at this one, I would definitely change it for her. She changed. And I think what's important to see is the shift that's present in the story. She comes to understand that it's her freedom that she's gaining. And of course, that's punctuated at the end with her death because of this joy that kills. You know, it's not that she's happy that her husband is alive. It's that the joy is gone now. Like with him being back, it's like, dang, I came to this understanding and it's now. When we look at your second answer, Dale, about society pressuring her, I think you would have to go a little beyond these quotes to help to show that. And if I was going to point you in a direction, look at how she feels before she comes to understand about that freedom. So if you went back a couple paragraphs, maybe to like 7 or 8, as she's sitting in that chair, as she's looking out the window, you notice that she becomes fearful. Her bosom is, you know, they say it's a tumult. It's going in and out. She's starting to hyperventilate. She's freaking out. She's afraid of what she's about to realize because society has told her, you need to be a wife. You know, this is how it goes. And she's going, oh, wait, but I can be happy to be free of him. As she comes to realize that she's fearful. So I would pull some of that in to help with this one. But that's a lot that you have to try to contextualize for an answer that we want to be a little shorter. This one works really well with what we have here. And you might have something similar. The way it looks doesn't matter. What's important is you have that answer. And when we write a response like this, we can do this in 5 sentences really simply. Our first sentence, like in any paragraph that we write, our topic sentence is going to answer the question. So if the question is how the marriage portrayed, you would say, in the story of an hour, the Mallard's marriage is portrayed as not being perfect, but still being loving. Our next sentence is where we prove that. We're going to use a quote. Better writing will embed these quotes within your sentence. Do you know what that means when I talk about embedding a quote? Yes, that's the quote part, but the embedding part. Do you understand? Have you learned how to embed quotes before? When we embed a quote, we don't dump the entire sentence from the story just right in our paragraph. Instead, we only use what we need. And you notice we kind of were doing that here by just taking sections of the sentence. And we would say something to the effect of this would look like, By embedding, we just take the part of the quote that we need and we fit it into our own sentence so that it lets us control the idea here. So do you see how rather than just going, yeah, she had loved him sometimes, we're able to lead the reader to it, that Mrs. Mallard realizes this. That embedding can help to elevate the level of our writing. And then our third sentence would explain it. This is where we bring in our commentary. Are we familiar with commentary? Is this a word you've heard before? You probably used it with persuasive writing, with expository writing. It's the same thing here. Commentary knits your thinking together. If you're going to tell me that this is your evidence, this is how you're going to prove the answer, your commentary would come behind and say, how does this sentence help to answer your question? So if you're telling me their marriage wasn't perfect, but it was still loving, you would be able to say, even though she didn't love him all the time, she clearly understands that at some points that loving feeling was present. It's the same way that when we were talking about the point, we were able to bring the ideas together to explain how they fit. It's the same process here in this sentence. Then for sentences 4 and 5, you use a second quote. So if you used this quote first, maybe you go, oh, that's cool. Let me talk about this one. That you know what? At times she felt like she had to do certain things, but now she has that freedom. Boom. We never want to have just one reason why we're correct. We always want at least two. And so writing it in this way gives us the opportunity to control the idea and be specific. Did I lose anybody in how we can answer this question in 5 sentences by using evidence from the piece? Is there anybody that feels like they can't do this at this point because we've got everything here that you need? Okay, so if we need more time than just until we have to pack up in about 15 minutes, you've got until 11:59, you're good. But today, we wrote this one together. Just put it into Canvas. Put the pieces together to answer the question, and that's what's due. Tomorrow, we're going to go